Good evening. Good evening. A warm welcome to you all, those here in the church and those also joining us online. Welcome. My name is Genevieve Razim, and it's a pleasure to serve as the rector of All Saints. It's also a pleasure to serve alongside the Reverend Dr. Travis Helms, campus missioner. So we welcome you here tonight and have a few things to share with you before we get going. So please know there's a question and answer session following. You should have received a note card and golf pencil as you came in. If you didn't, raise your hand and Dawn will get one to you. Okay, great. And then please know everyone is invited to refreshments on the lawn following the event. And then of course, the all-important restrooms. They are located in Gregg House, the building behind the church. So now, Travis and I are pleased to welcome our special guest, the Reverend Dr. Michael Lloyd. He is the principal of Wycliffe Hall, the theological college within the University of Oxford. He was formerly the chaplain at the Queen's College, University of Oxford, and the director of studies in theology at Christ College, Cambridge University. Not a bad CV. Dr. Lloyd has taught theology and doctrine at the University of Oxford, Cambridge University, and St. Paul's Theological Center, London. See, there's even more. Michael is author and popular level systematic theology, entitled Cafe Theology, and a regular contributor to the theological podcast cleverly named The God Pod. He has a particular interest in the doctrine of evil, the problem of pain, and an inexplicable love of cricket. And Travis and I can also share with you, he's a delightful lunch companion. So Michael, it's wonderful to have you here. Let us welcome Michael Lloyd.
Thank you very much, Genevieve. Delightful lunch companion. That goes delightful lunch companion. That's the way that goes. It was a delightful lunch, and I was a companion. But thank you very much for your welcome. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for the excuse to come back to Texas, which I love. I'm slightly nervous beginning here because, well, I'll explain the background. Some years ago, I was acting chaplain at one of the other Oxford colleges, and it was Pentecost Sunday, and I was preaching, so I went in ahead of time, put my notes in the chaplain's pew, and I went into the vestry, I robed up, I processed in behind the choir, I came to my pew, and there my notes weren't. And in their place was a little piece of paper that said, "It's Pentecost Sunday, be inspired." And from that day to this, I've always kept a copy of my notes in my pocket on my person. So that I'm never put in that situation again. But today, the reason I'm slightly nervous is I've had to give my copy to Matthew so that he knows when to move on the slides. So I'm feeling mildly naked in front of you, but we'll do our best. I'm afraid that you may not be able to see the script on some of the slides, so I will try and remember to read those out as we go, which means that the pulpit is slightly crammed, for which I apologize. I've given my intellectual life, as Genevieve was saying, to the problem of evil, the problem of suffering, to the ever-pressing question of why a good God would allow such appalling suffering in the world, which I hope is the reason why my students call me Dr. Evil. That's a minor example of what I'm talking about just happened behind me, and I now have wet socks, but never mind. Travis, I think let's just leave it. Well, there we go. Yes. Glass splinters down the thigh, it's always helpful. So much has been written by so many people over so many centuries, it's perhaps surprising that people still find new things to say on this subject. But actually, there are still hugely under-researched areas. There are lacunae, if you like, that have been strangely overlooked. And one of those is the attitude Jesus himself took to the problem of evil. Most of the scholarly literature is of a philosophical nature. There's a certain amount of theological reflection, there's some biblical analysis, but virtually nothing has focused on the person of Jesus himself. Call me old-fashioned, I think that might be relevant. And I want to try in a brief and sketchy way to rectify that a little this evening. So what I want to do first of all is to lay out very briefly a map of the scholarly literature on the problem of suffering. And then I want to look at the Gospels to see where Jesus fits in, if he does, on that map. And to do that, I want to look at every instance in the Gospels where Jesus is in the presence of suffering, and to see what his reaction is to that suffering in that situation. So I've asked All Saints if they'd kindly provide a packed breakfast for us all about 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. We'll take a short break at 4 a.m. to ask for your special dietary needs. That's the plan. So here's my map. I think there are basically three main families of response to the problem of evil within Christian theology. Three categories of what's known as theodicy. Theodicy is simply the word, a technical posh word used in academic circles for responses to the problem of evil. It comes from two Greek words, theos, God, dike, righteous. It's attempts to show that God is righteous in the face of the world's suffering. And I think that most attempts by Christian thinkers to deal with this vital question fit more or less easily within these three categories. The first is the view that suffering is instrumental to the purposes of God. It is instrumental to God's purposes. And just so that you don't miss out, that is Calvin saying, "Why can't we get a snowblower? We must be the only family in the world that still shovels the driveway by hand. I'm freezing." And his father was saying, "It builds character, keep at it." So this instrumental view, it says, yes, God did create a world in which such appalling suffering is built in to the way things are, but he's not culpable for doing that, because suffering is a necessary ingredient to some good things that happen. So however bad it may seem at the time, the world is actually a richer place, and we are deeper people for the presence of suffering in our world and in our lives. This view believes that suffering serves some good purpose, which warrants God creating a world in which it happens. Sometimes, as in this cartoon, suffering is seen as character building. Sometimes it's argued that some of the higher order qualities in human beings depend upon suffering. You can't show compassion unless there's suffering to be compassionate about. You can't show courage unless there's threat. Sometimes it is argued that suffering brings an aesthetic richness to creation. Just as a painting needs dark colours as well as light colours, just as a symphony needs discord as well as harmony, so the world is a richer place overall for having suffering within it. Sometimes it's claimed that if everything existed in perfect harmony without clash and without pain, it would be so obvious that God exists that we would have no freedom to reject him. And therefore, that our ability to love God freely is dependent upon the current ambiguity of the world. And its suffering that makes the world ambiguous. The world is currently interpreted by intelligent and decent people as the creation of a good and loving God, and it's interpreted by equally intelligent and equally decent people as merely the product of random and impersonal forces, and we're therefore free to choose. If there were no suffering, says this view, it would be blindingly obvious that it's the creation of a good and loving God, so we would not be free to choose. So there are different goods for which suffering is said to be necessary, but in all of them, God uses suffering as his instrument to bring about some good thing, some good quality, some good state of affairs that wouldn't be possible through any other means. So that's the first of the three families of response to the problem of evil, the instrumental family. The second is that which views suffering as inevitable within God's purposes. In this view, God doesn't want suffering. He doesn't deliberately build it into his creation. It thinks we'd be better off without it. But it suggests that it's simply not possible for God unilaterally to bring about a pain-free world. It's simply not possible to have a physical world without having clashes between some of the different elements of that physical world. I've shown there the front cover of Christopher Southgate's book, The Groaning of Creation, because Christopher is one of the main proponents of this position, and he points out that it's the competitive, violent, destructive struggle for survival that brings about the admirable speed of the cheetah, for instance, the breathtakingly beautiful flight of the swift, and indeed the intellectual ability of the human. These are things that come about to get a competitive advantage in the struggle for survival. The darting flight of the swift is something of extraordinary beauty, but it does it to kill things. And, says this view, you can't have one without the other. That's the inevitable view of suffering. And the third family of response to the problem of evil is that suffering simply has no place within the purposes of God. There's a cartoon there of Adam and Eve. Eve has just eaten the apple, and she's saying, I just realized we're naked and your jokes are terrible. So this view, as I say, suggests that God is opposed to suffering. He hates it. It's not of him in any way. People who support this view, therefore, have a bit of explaining to do. If he doesn't want it and he's omnipotent, why does it happen? And people who take the view that suffering is inimical to the purposes of God tend to resort to some doctrine of the fall, that something has happened, that things are not the way that they were intended to be, that they no longer have that harmony that was always God's intention for his world, because free creatures have used their freedom to reject God's purposes. That's why the world no longer reflects God's loving and harmonious purposes for it. And that's why I put a cartoon of Adam and Eve on this slide, though I have to say that if my wife had said that to me, I'd have taken it as evidence that the fall had corrupted her epistemic faculties. There's simply no other explanation. And then possibly the first murder might have taken place a bit earlier than it did. So there are the three categories, and what I want to do now is to see into which of these three categories Jesus himself seems to fit, if any. And as I say, to do that, I'm going to take you on a whistle-stop tour of all the occasions in the Gospels when you see Jesus in the presence of suffering. And I'm going to take the timeline of Mark's Gospel as my structure, adding in examples from the other Gospels when they have stories that Mark doesn't. So here we go. And this is the man in the synagogue at Capernaum. And the little quotation there from Mark 1, Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be silent and come out of him." And the unclean spirit, throwing him into convulsions and crying with a loud voice, came out of him. They were all amazed. So Mark's account of Jesus' engagement with suffering begins with a confrontation between Jesus and whatever the evil spirit represents. Mark portrays Jesus as coming into immediate conflict with some organized destructive force. It sees him as competing for possession with some shadowy, mysterious, and malevolent power. It sees him as invading the territory of this alien tyranny. Now, we don't think comfortably within such categories today. Our worldview doesn't really have a place for such thinking. But we shouldn't let that blind us to the fact that it was precisely in these sorts of categories that Jesus himself understood his own mission. Secondly, we have the account of Jesus healing Simon Peter's mother-in-law of a fever. Now, a fever was a hugely threatening condition before the advent of modern medicine, as any of you who've read Jane Austen novels will know. And what we learn here is that Jesus seems as offended by the presence of physical sickness as he does by the controlling, destructive invasion of human beings by an enemy force. So he just heals her. The last time I told a mother-in-law joke in a sermon, I got told off by my bishop, so you have him to thank for being spared that one. The next episode contains both exorcisms and healings, and it's a kind of summary of the group healings and exorcisms that were said to have taken place one evening. Note in passing that they bring to him what they think of as one category. They say they brought to him many who are possessed by demons, and he divides them into two categories. And he cast out the spirits with a word and cured all who are sick. So they bring him one category, the demon-possessed. He divides them into two, the demon-possessed and the sick. People often suggest that the reason there are so many cases of possession in first century Palestine is because people didn't have the medical categories that we do. If they did, they'd have realized that none of these people are demon-possessed. They just had medical and psychological conditions that the people of the day didn't know about. This little statement in Matthew suggests to me that maybe Jesus did know the difference between demon possession and physical sickness, even if his contemporaries didn't, and that he treated them differently. But the main thing for our purposes is that he cured all who are sick, all. He doesn't say to some of them, no, your sickness is a real benefit to you, it's clearly doing you good, I'll leave you as you are, you have a good day now. He just healed them, all of them. There was no triage. If they were sick, he would heal them. And in his teaching, he didn't say, blessed are you who mourn because grief will deepen you and make you more sensitive to the pain of others. No, he says you are blessed because you'll be comforted. By which he doesn't mean that someone will give them a hug and say they're there. He means that the cause of their grief will be taken away. The bereavement will be undone, ultimately. There's a remarkable book that a Christian philosopher called Nicholas Walterstorff wrote called Lament for a Son, in which he records his thoughts and feelings in the aftermath of the death of his son in a climbing accident. It's a remarkably profound and moving work, and I recommend it to you. And one of his observations is this: for that grief, what consolation can there be other than having him back? And that, I think, is what Jesus is here promising. that there will be an undoing of death. Again, he's not encouraging people to accept the way things are. He's promising that the way things are will at last be overturned. And it's that final restoration that changes the objective status of the mourner into one of blessedness. I don't know if you remember, some of you will remember perhaps the film Babe. Again, I'm showing, as I often do, how much I have my finger on the pulse of modern popular culture. It probably came out about 40 years ago. But in that, there's a duck who realizes that if you don't have a job on the farm, you tend to end up in the pot. And that's no prospect for an ambitious duck. So he decides he needs to get himself a job, and he impersonates an alarm clock and wakes the farmer up at the right time every morning. The horse disapproves of this posturing and pretense and says, "The secret of happiness is knowing that the way things are is the way things are." To which the duck says, "Well, the way things are stinks." And that means that the duck has a doctrine of the fall. Whereas the horse doesn't. And I think that is what Jesus is suggesting here. Staying with Jesus' teaching rather than his healing for a moment, it's just worth noticing that the Sermon on the Mount, which is the biggest chunk of Jesus' teaching that we have, contains precisely nothing about how to live with suffering. One of the biggest existential questions any of us has to face. It has a tiny bit about persecution, but nothing about any other kind of suffering. And most of what he tells us about persecution is to flee it. Run for the hills. When they persecute you in one city, flee to the next. He seems to be more interested in avoiding or undoing suffering than giving us wise advice about how to live with it. Oh yes, I ought to tell you that's Jesus on the Sermon on the Mount saying, "So that's it, you can follow me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram and Snapchat." There we go. Might have got better purchase had he done that. Here we have another group statement. Jesus went throughout Galilee, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the good news of the kingdom and curing every disease and every sickness among the people. They brought to him all the sick, those who were afflicted with various diseases and pains, demoniacs, epileptics, and paralytics, and he cured them. Again, notice the every disease and every sickness. Jesus seems to be waging this offensive on every front simultaneously. The next one is the healing of a leper. A leper came to him, begging him and kneeling. He said to him, "If you choose, you can make me clean." If you choose. There seems to be no sense of the power or authority of Jesus being in any way the issue here. Suffering does not seem to be inevitable within the purposes of God. Jesus, in the view of the leper, is perfectly capable of undoing the leprosy. And Jesus doesn't demur from the leper's confidence in him. He doesn't say, "Well, I appreciate your confidence in me, but to be honest, it's not quite that straightforward." No, the issue is whether Jesus wants to do it, and he does. And the significant fact is that never in the Gospels does he not choose to, does he not want to. He always chooses to do it. And that seems to me to give a pretty good clue as to Jesus' settled attitude to suffering. And therefore, if Jesus is who the church believes he is, to God's settled view of suffering. So I don't think this episode sits easily with either the inevitable or the instrumental views of the problem of suffering. Next, is the centurion's paralyzed servant. The centurion says, "Lord, my servant is lying at home, paralyzed in terrible distress." Jesus says, "I will come and cure him." There's no pause for thought here. No hiatus. It's just Jesus' immediate and instinctive response. Very good, I'll come. That's who he is, that's what he does, that's how he thinks. There's no question about it. There's no decision to be made. It's a no-brainer. Of course, I'm on my way. But is that what you'd expect if God is using suffering as an instrument for good? Wouldn't curing people without stopping to think about it mean he was in danger of working against the purposes of God? So it's not just possession and sickness and grief, it's also the causes of grief. Tony Blair, a previous Prime Minister of the UK, famously told the electorate that he was against crime and the causes of crime. Well, it seems as if Jesus is against grief and the causes of grief. Even death is on the receiving end of his offensive, and this is the widow of Nain's son. He has compassion for the widow of Nain, but that compassion doesn't take the form of helping her to navigate life without her son. It doesn't take the form of introducing her to the 5 stages of grief. It doesn't take the form of assuring her that grief will deepen her and she'll be much better equipped to help other grieving people. It takes the form of undoing death. It seems that he can undo death without undoing any good. No good seems to be dependent upon the death. Austin Farrer, who was a great Anglican thinker of the 20th century, took the view that suffering was inevitable within the purposes of God and wrote this: "Poor limping world, why does not your kind Creator pull the thorn out of your paw? But what sort of a thorn is this? And if it were pulled out, how much of the paw would remain? How much indeed of the creation?" But Jesus here seems to pull out the thorn of death without pulling out any of the paw at all. The next one is the healing of the paralytic. I had to preach on this in a prison chapel on one occasion. I was there as part of the chaplaincy team, you understand, rather than for any other purposes. And as the gospel reading was read out about how the friends broke through the roof to lower the paralytic down to where Jesus was, a loud stage whisper from one of the inmates said, "You'll get done for criminal damage, you will." Probably said with experience. God doesn't like sin, but Jesus here doesn't just forgive his sins, he heals his paralysis. Sin and suffering seem equally inimical to the purposes of God, if the words and actions of Jesus here are anything to go by. And notice that Jesus here didn't invite the man to take comfort in the loyalty and love of his friends. He doesn't say, "There are you happy," as Friar Lawrence does to Romeo, trying to cheer him up. He tells him to take up his mat and walk. The next slide is of the time when John the Baptist sends some of his disciples to find out what's going on in the ministry of Jesus and to report back to him. That's John the Baptist there in the icon in his prison, looking rather like Robinson Crusoe in his rather fetching camel hair onesie, and sending off some of his disciples to ask Jesus a question. And what Jesus says as a response, he says, take back this message. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the poor have good news brought to them. So he's undoing those things. That's what his ministry looks like. The next one is the man with the withered hand. And notice that Jesus does not invite the man to look for the hand of God at work in his illness. For Jesus, the hand of God is to be seen in Jesus' own hand stretched out to heal. Just notice for a moment here that the word in Greek that Mark uses for restored, when his hand is restored, is the same word that is used elsewhere for the universal restoration at the end of time, for the cosmic putting right of all things. In other words, Mark's saying, what Jesus is doing for this one man's hand is what God is going to do for the whole creation, for the whole created order. God is in the business of restoring all things. So this man's hand is just a little pointer towards a little glimpse of the coming cosmic renewal. Now, I gather that the All Saints folk are not going to be able to provide a packed breakfast for everyone, so I'm going to have to hurry through a few of these and just linger on one or two where there are particular points to notice. That's another of the group healings and exorcisms. And that one, the next one is healing of a demoniac who was blind and mute. The next one is worth pausing on in the sense that others are being invited to share in Jesus' offensive against the enemy kingdom. Others are being recruited. He appointed 12, whom he named apostles, to be with him and to be sent out to proclaim the message and to have authority to cast out demons. Others are being recruited to carry on the same assault on suffering and what maybe lies behind suffering as we see in the ministry of Jesus. They're to engage in the same warfare. They're to make no peace with the suffering they see around them. They're to push back against the occupying force, which is not Rome, but, well, we'll see. The next one is the first Rembrandt of the evening, but not the last, you'll be pleased to hear, and it's the stilling of the storm. The Cornish poet Jack Claymo wrote this: when the storm arose on Gennesaret, Jesus did not bid the disciples to humble themselves before the great being who was trying to drown them. No, he lashed back at the elements from his bridgehead in the divine kingdom. The purpose of Jesus with regard to suffering, threat, and death is not educational, it's salvific. Matthew gives us another stilling of the storm story, though this time the disciples get who he is. The first time they say, "Who is this that the winds and waves obey him?" This time they know, and they worship him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." And here at last is a human being doing what human beings were always called to do, namely fulfilling the divine summons to fill the earth and subdue it, which suggested there was something that needed to be subdued. And here he is doing it, ridding the world of all that mars and deforms it, robbing it of threat and fear. Now we have a group of female patrons who supported Jesus. The 12 with him, says Luke, as well as some women who had been cured of evil spirits and infirmities. Again, co-workers being recruited. And the next is the Gadarene Demoniac. And the cartoon says, Jesus sends the demons into the herd of pigs who jump into the lake. thus performing the miracle of turning water into swine, for which I can only apologize. Perhaps nowhere do you see the restoring nature of Jesus' work more clearly than here, where someone who had been self-harming and violent is sitting there clothed and in his right mind. I think it would have been pretty difficult to look at him beforehand and seen good in his suffering. My brother had a massive stroke when he was in his 40s and was never able to move or speak again. I find it pretty difficult to see any good in that situation. I'm therefore emotionally predisposed against the suffering is good for you line, or the instrumental view of suffering within the purposes of God. The next slide is of the woman with the hemorrhage touching the robe of Jesus, and the one after that is the raising of Jairus' daughter. Note that Jesus does not tell the mourners in Jairus' house to stop wailing because death is nothing at all, or because it's an inevitable part of the cycle of life, or because it's all part of the purpose of God. No, he tells them to stop mourning because he's about to undo it. The next slide is of Jesus healing 2 blind people. And then the one after that is another group summary about Jesus curing every disease and every sickness. And then the one after that is also a group summary. But I'm going to pause on this one because it's quite an interesting one. Not that the others aren't, you understand, but for our current purposes. Because we're told here, it says, and he could do no deed of power there, except that he laid his hands on a few sick people and healed them. And he was amazed at their unbelief. We're told that there was at least one time when Jesus couldn't heal. But we're never told that he wouldn't. And yet that is often the line that Christian theologians and theodicists give you. I think it's really interesting that never in the entire gospel narratives is that ever said. The next slide is a reconstruction of the pool of Bethesda based on recent archaeology, where he healed another paralytic person. Slide 30 is the sending out of the 12 who were sent out to anoint with oil many who were sick and cured them, casting out many demons. And the next is the sending out of the 70 to whom he says, cure the sick who are there and say to them, the kingdom of God has come near. And then there's the feeding of the 5,000. I don't know if you can see that, but it's, can you see that? Okay, very good. When I last spoke on this subject, I was asked about the difference between pain and suffering, and whether hunger could really be classed as suffering if you knew where your next meal was coming from. Whether it is or not, Jesus addresses it here and assuages it. And then there's another kind of group summary. Wherever he went, they laid the sick in the marketplaces and begged him that they might touch even the fringe of his cloak, and all who touched it were healed. Notice again the everywhere he went and the all who touched it. And as evidence of the everywhere bit, here we see it In the next one, the Syrophoenician woman. Everywhere was the arena of Jesus' healing activity. Here it is extending beyond the borders of Israel to a Syrophoenician woman. Nor is it simply physical, psychological, or spiritual need that is healingly addressed, nor just guilt. Public shame is dismantled here by the woman in John 8, to whom he says, let anyone among you who's without sin be the first to throw a stone at her. He's undoing shame as well as everything else. That's the deaf-mute Gentile man. And then we have the feeding of the 4,000. I've a nasty feeling that icon is actually of the 5,000. I was misled by the number of baskets. But I think the fact that Jesus seems to have 5 loaves and 2 small fish skewered on his kebab stick suggests to me that it's probably the 5,000, so I apologize for that. But again, this is another example of the extension of his work beyond the tribes of Israel, because the feeding of the 4,000 seems to have happened in Gentile territory. Then we have the healing of the possessed person after the Transfiguration. Again, it seems to me, if you are able, Jesus says, all things can be done for the one who believes. That seems to be difficult to square with the suffering as inevitable position. The next slide is of the woman crippled by a spirit, and we'll come back to that one. Then we have the man with dropsy. And then we have the healing of Bartimaeus' blindness. That, by the way, is a 9th century carving of the healing of blind Bartimaeus. I wanted to have stone carving as well as paintings to illustrate these episodes, and I searched everyone for a while, and eventually found this. So that's a relief. Then we have the healing of the 10 lepers, again, extending beyond the bounds of Israel. Possibly what's happening there is that the northern kingdom is finally being brought back into communion with the southern kingdom. It's a Samaritan who is healed there, along with the other 9. Can you read that one? So it's Join Us Palm Sunday, and there's a woman who dressed up as a kind of palm reader saying, this line means you'll hire me to run your big event. And there you have Jesus and the colt. It's not really suffering, but perhaps the fact that Jesus is able to ride an unschooled, untrained, previously unridden animal is a sign that even the disharmonies of the natural world, even the relationship between the natural world and the human world that was ruptured at the fall, is now being put right. The next is the woman with the alabaster jar. Jesus says, leave her alone. Why do you trouble her? Wherever the good news is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in remembrance of her. Another example of his assault on shame and the way we shame one another. We're getting through them. Do not panic. The healing of the high priest's servant's ear that Peter had cut off. So not just another healing, but also an implicit protest against the use of violence. And then we have the resurrection itself. We've seen Jesus assault death before, but this is an assault on death with a capital D. This is an assault not just on the death of an individual person like Lazarus or Jairus' daughter. This is an assault on the fact and the future of death and an undoing of the institution of death itself. So there you are. I'm sorry about that. You've had to sit through 42 slides in my whistle-stop tour of the occasions of the Gospels when you see Jesus and suffering together. 42 reported incidents or groups of incidents, in every single one of which we see him responding to suffering by removing it, by attacking it, by undoing it, which seems to me, therefore, to embody the view of suffering as being inimical to the purposes of God. There are two, however, that I've left out thus far that might be thought and have been argued to be exceptions to this view and to support the instrumental view. So I want to look at those very briefly, and they're both in John's Gospel. The first is in John 9, where his disciples say to him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" And Jesus answers, "Neither this man nor his parents sinned, but so that God's works might be revealed in him." That seems to suggest that God deliberately and knowingly made this person to be born blind so that God could reveal his power and bring himself glory through healing him. Now, not only does that go against the trend of almost all the other evidence in the Gospels, but I find it really disturbing. Supposing, and here's, I'll read you what it says. Stephen began to wonder if his surgery was as necessary as they first said. The doctor was saying, "We decided to replace your large and small intestines with 2 medium ones." And I've put that there because I have a thought experiment. Supposing I were a fantastically skilled surgeon and wanted to prove to you how good a surgeon I was. I could tell you how good I am. I could say, "I'm the best surgeon in the world." And you'd go, "Yeah, cut it out." Or words to that effect. So I might say, "Look, I'll show you. I'll smash your leg into multiple pieces, and then I'll do an extraordinary job putting the whole thing back together again." I think most ethics committees would balk at that. I think they would say that surgeons are there to put things right, not to put things wrong so that they can then put them right afterwards. Especially if there was a 20-year gap between my shattering your leg and my operating on it. Even post-COVID, waiting times are not that bad. What sort of a God is it who's prepared to cause his creatures to suffer for his own self-glorification? And how does that fit with what John himself teaches us a few chapters later, that God is glorified not by others suffering for him, but by him suffering for them? That's where you see the glory of God. It seems to run counter to everything we know about God and to be deeply troubling. Thankfully, it's not the only way to translate that passage. I don't have time now to go into the technical linguistics of this way of translating it, which is what people always say when what they mean is, I don't actually have the ability to go into the technical linguistics of it. There are others better qualified than I am here today to do that sort of thing. But Greg Boyd and others have pointed out that the Greek phrase there can be translated not so that the works of God might be revealed in him, but let the works of God be done in him. That transforms the meaning of that passage. And it's worth remembering that Jesus does heal him. So once again, we see Jesus in the presence of suffering doing what we always see him do in the presence of suffering, namely undoing it. And the second possible exception is the story of Lazarus in John 11. When Jesus hears the news of his friend Lazarus' illness, he doesn't immediately go to heal him. He stays where he is for 2 days, saying, "This illness does not lead to death, rather it is for God's glory, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it." Now, there's no sense that Lazarus' illness was divinely sent. only that Jesus caused unnecessary grief by delaying the healing for 2 days for the sake of his own glory. Now, I'm not sure I've thought this through to my own satisfaction yet, but here's a couple of quick points. First, Tom Wright makes the point that Jesus thanks the Father that he has heard him at the tomb side. And he does that after the stone had been rolled away from the tomb, but before there was any sign of life. And he suggests that that's because there was no smell. There'd been no decay, despite Lazarus having been dead for 4 days. In other words, when he heard the news of Lazarus' illness, Jesus had known that Lazarus would die and had prayed that the Father would keep Lazarus' body from decay in readiness for when he was there to revivify him. And when on opening the tomb there was no smell, Jesus thanked his Father for having heard his prayer. He didn't, therefore, do nothing. He did what was needful. And again, he then undid Lazarus' death. So again, Jesus, in the presence of suffering and death, undoes them. In fact, I can think of no greater picture of the inimicality of death to the purposes of God than Jesus breaking down in grief and anger at the tomb of Lazarus, despite knowing that he's about to return him to life. Because death shouldn't be. It's an obscenity. It's a gross distortion of the purposes and the love of God. So I don't think there is any exception to the conclusion that whenever you see Jesus in the presence of another person's suffering, you see Jesus attacking that suffering. And therefore, in the actions and attitudes of Jesus, suffering seems to be inimical to the purposes of God. That's not what people have always been told by Christian theologians and apologists. Apologists have sometimes felt they need to justify the sufferings of the world in order to maintain the goodness of God. That suffering must be good because God lets it happen. I suggest that Jesus saw suffering not as a friend in disguise, but as an enemy to be attacked. And I don't think that as Christian theologians we have any warrant to see God as planning, intending, or willing suffering. He's good, he loves us, and he's committed to the ultimate and final elimination of suffering. And the danger of justifying suffering is that not only are we defending the indefensible, but we're justifying what God is assaulting. And by making God the cause of people's suffering, we're making him their enemy, when in fact it's the suffering that's the enemy. So, justifications of suffering such as this, I suggest, pay too much respect to suffering, treating it as fertile for good when it isn't. All justifications or glorifications of suffering are in danger. Can you read that one? Just about. Mother Teresa saying, the suffering of the poor is something very beautiful, and the world is being very much helped by the nobility of this example of misery and suffering. I think justifications or glorifications of suffering are in danger of seeing as beautiful and noble that which is appalling, and that to which God is committed to its eradication. And then the next one says, I think he intends to try you like gold in the crucible. Sorry, we can go back one. Yes, that's it. So as to number you among his most faithful servants. Therefore you must lovingly embrace all occasions of suffering, considering them as precious tokens of his love. To suffer in silence and without complaint is what he asks of you. I think that is asking us lovingly to embrace what God in Christ angrily attacks. and that all justifications and glorifications of suffering need to be confronted with the attitudes and actions of Jesus. I think I'm going to leave it there. The rest, there's more, but I think that can come out in discussion. I think you've suffered long enough, really. And not believing that suffering is good for you, I'm going to stop doing it and then hand over to Genevieve to take us into the question time.
Thank you, Michael. So we're hoping you have questions, that you've written them down on your note card. And so Dawn and I will come along and gather those. We'll make a couple of passes. And we went with the note card way. So those of you who are a little more shy, participate, please.
We were just joking. I was saying we were going to situate Michael here in the middle, Transfiguration-wise. And Genevieve and I can be Moses and Elijah. He said, or else the crucified Christ with two thieves on either side of him. So, Michael, perhaps I could just get us started. Yes. I feel that Matthew did reveal a little bit of a teaser slide, and that you were maybe going to propose some theories about what the origin is of this evil and suffering that Jesus tends to want to attack whenever he's in its presence. Could you
spill the beans?
Spill the beans a little bit, yeah.
I'm happy to spill the beans. So the problem, the problem with the doctrine of the fall is that it's difficult to blame all suffering and the creation going wrong on human beings, because since Darwin, we know that there's been pain, killing, suffering, and death, disease, and predation long before human beings ever emerged. So it won't do to blame it all on human beings. And therefore, I just noticed that in Christian and Jewish theology, rebellion doesn't begin with human beings. There is a tradition of belief in spiritual forces that we are normally unaware of, but might be nonetheless real for that. And that if there was rebellion, as this tradition, Jewish and Christian traditions both say, if there's been rebellion in that realm, that could have distorted the whole way in which creation developed, luring it away from God's original harmonious purposes. And that is the ultimate cause of what's gone wrong. So my scenario, and it's a good word, scenario, it always reminds me of a kind of Shakespearean character somehow. Scenario, in love with the fair agenda or something like that. My scenario is God begins the process of creation. There's a rebellion within the spiritual dimension of that. So interconnected are the different dimensions of creation that what happens in the spiritual dimension affects the material world. Through a now distorted and competitive and violent process of evolution, you get human beings emerging. It's then God's intention that human beings should undo what's gone wrong, fill the earth and subdue it, which suggests that there's also already something that's gone wrong even before human beings rebel. And that if you want to see what it would have looked like for human beings to have done that, you look at the person of Jesus. There he is doing it, stilling the storms, healing the sick, raising the dead, driving out demons. That is what human beings were called to do and didn't. But there in the person of Jesus, it's now beginning to happen. And he calls his 12 and then the 70 and then us to join us in that divine assault on suffering, which is what I think we've signed up for. So that's a brief kind of...
Could I ask just one follow-up question?
Yeah, of course.
And this might be kind of splitting some philosophical or metaphysical hairs here, but
Yep.
if for there to be rebellion in heaven, is that a threat to God's transcendence in any way, God's omnipotence and omniscience, etc.?
I don't think it's a threat to that, because it just means that he's not the sort of God who overwhelms people, overwhelms creatures, dominates them. It means he's the sort of God who allows people the space to make their own choices and their own decisions. In the same way that a good parent actually does not dominate their children and make it impossible for them to make any other choice than the parent wants. They give them the space to be who they are, to choose who they want to be. And without that freedom, without that space, there's no such thing as love. Because love has to be freely given, or it's nothing at all. And God is the sort of person who does not dominate, who does not compete with us for space, as Rowan Williams is always saying, who does not overwhelm us but gives us space to be who we choose to be. Now, he has a view as to what choices we make, and he will be trying to woo us, but it's a wooing and not an overwhelming.
That's beautiful. Did we collect cards, or?
Oh,
So you get another one while they're being
right.
collected.
Anyone
in.
else?
Oh, I love it. No, I love that image of.
Well, Charlotte.
Because
It was going to be a lengthy right now.
Well, is it your time for retaliation?
Okay,
Yep.
so why the persistence of suffering after Jesus? Why Old Testament suffering despite God being present? Example, Sodom and Gomorrah and the order to kill every man, woman, child, and animal in Jericho. If suffering is inimical, why do people who suffer also often become some of the best and most active combatants against further suffering?
Okay. There's three really good questions there. Let me start with the last one first, just to kind of so I get on a roll.
Okay.
Can you repeat it?
Here, I'll give you the card.
There we go. If suffering is inimical to the purposes of God, why do people who suffer so often become some of the best and most active combatants against further suffering? I'm not saying that God cannot bring good out of suffering. I think he can. And I've seen that in the sort of people that the questioner is asking about. All I'm saying is that when God brings good out of suffering, it's God we have to thank, not the suffering. And that our ways of becoming good people that don't involve having to go through suffering. The suffering is not essential. There's one of the people who argues for the instrumental view, John Hick, says at one point, if we didn't have illness and suffering and disease, we wouldn't have the kind of scientific attack on suffering. We wouldn't have the scientific endeavor and the curiosity and trying, because it's that sort of, it's trying to overcome disease that makes scientists engage in that. I don't believe that. I think natural innate curiosity is enough to get people involved in scientific exploration of the world. That's just who we are. That's how we're made. I think it's paying too much respect to suffering. It's destructive. Left to its own devices, it is destructive. Now, can God bring good out of it? Yes. But as I say, when he does, it's him we have to thank, not the suffering. That would be my first one. Why the persistence of suffering after Jesus? I think because God does not impose himself on anybody. He seeks to woo us. So what comes after Jesus is the wooing and the spreading out of that wooing throughout the world. And there again, we're still given a choice. We're not overwhelmed. We're not forced. And so the time between Jesus' first coming and his second coming is a time where he woos us. He woos people through us. Mm-hmm. There is that attempt to get people willingly to cooperate with the love from which they sprang. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, you could have brought it to an end, but that would have involved either all of us not existing, which I think would be a shame, or it would have involved forcing people to believe in him, which is a contradiction in terms. Mm-hmm. Yes, the Old Testament kind of order to kill every man, woman, child, and animal in Jericho. I think that's actually the strongest argument against the Christian faith. Mm. Much harder than the problem of suffering, actually. And I notice, I want to suggest that there are things in the teaching of Jesus that sit very ill with that sort of thing. So there's a point at which Jesus goes into near a Samaritan village, and they come out and ask him to leave. And the disciples say, "Would you like us to call down fire from heaven on him, on this village?" Mm. And he rebukes them. But that's what Elijah did. Mm-hmm. He did call down fire from heaven on his enemies. And I think what I would say is we follow Jesus and not Elijah. Mm. We follow Jesus and not Joshua. Mm. And without in any way taking away from the value or the importance of the Old Testament, Jesus is offering something new. The very fact that he was so controversial suggests to me that he wasn't saying exactly what everybody else had said before him. No, he was saying something quite new, and there was a critique of what had gone before, as well as an affirmation. It's more complex, I think, than simply to say there's nothing to choose between the Old Testament and the New. No, there is something new about the New Testament, and in the end we are people whose belief in Scripture involves the whole of Scripture. You can't just take bits out and apply them without bringing them through the person of Jesus. That's what Christian interpretation of Scripture is. And when you do that, it's Jesus shaped the other side of it. So that may be controversial, but I think there's a lot of places actually where the New Testament is in slight tension with bits of the Old. And that's not to say that they're not important. It's not to say that they aren't part of the inspired Scriptures, but they're part of the inspired Scriptures that need to be read through the lens of Jesus.
Charlotte and then Bertie.
My apologies for not writing it down. I don't know that I can articulate my question as well as you have articulated your view. So I was just wondering about the suffering of Jesus himself.
Yeah.
40 days leading up to the cross, which is significant suffering, and how that kind of relates to all that you were saying.
The first thing, it's a really good question, and I think the first thing I would say is he wasn't very keen on his own suffering either. Let this cup pass from me. So there wasn't a heroic, grrr, off we go, kind of thing towards suffering. He shrank from it in the garden in particular. So that's, I think, the first thing to note. The second thing is but if it, nevertheless, not my will, but thine be done. Not that it's God's will for him to suffer either, but it is his will for human suffering to be undone. And there is this thing about Jesus, the patristic motto was, what is not assumed is not healed. Unless the human condition is brought into contact, direct contact with the person of God, it can't be put right. And therefore, if suffering is to be put right, it needs to be brought into contact with God. It needs the resources and the transforming, healing power of God to be brought directly to bear in it. That's what's going on the cross, is that the suffering of Jesus is in the person of Jesus, all brought into absolute contact with the divine reality and the healing power of God. And that's what can bring about a change, because the two have finally touched. A bit like the kind of creation of Adam.
The Michelangelo
painting. That's finally happening at the cross. So I think it is a Jesus going to where we are so that the situation can be different. But that doesn't mean he likes it, quite the reverse. Is that anywhere near an answer to what you're saying?
Great, thank you. Yeah.
Birdie.
This is too poorly formed to commit to paper. But it seems to me that the inimical, that option 3 and option 2 are not necessarily in conflict. I can imagine a sort of option 2 inevitability which grows out of the fall. And I think this is John Cottingham, who teaches at Reading's view.
Yeah.
That pre-fall, obviously, all is in a state of harmony. And post-fall, we live in a world in which if you and I try and occupy the same space, we both get bruised.
Yes.
And so there is a degree of inevitability, but they don't seem conflicting. And I sort of want to defend Farah because I'm a big fan. And I wonder if the thorn in the paw is not cancer, but is free will.
Sorry, say that again.
Oh, I wonder if the thorn in the paw is not cancer, but is free will, such that if God removes our free will, in fact, the paw is destroyed. My humanity is destroyed if I don't have the freedom to love him or to reject his love. So I just wonder if there's a sort of, I don't know, if there's an option 2.5 to prove up.
Okay. I mean, the last bit I entirely agree with about the free will, but then I don't think the free will is ever removed.
Right, and I think that's what he was saying.
Yeah. That raises other questions that we can explore, but I would very strongly say, no, this is an essential part of what it is to be human, and you don't have love without it, which is what we're for. As for the inevitability thing, but we are promised a world put right, in which the wolf lies down with the lamb, presumably without having eaten it first. So it is possible. And if it isn't possible, what happens to our eschatology? What happens to our future hope? You have to go cap in hand to Plato at that point, I think, which I don't want to do. So I'm struggling to see the need for 2.5, 6, 7, or 8. But let's have that conversation over refreshments.
Thank you so much. I'm trying to pull, okay, now what have we learned from all of this? What are we to do now with our lives? And one thing I struggle with is I think solidarity in love and compassion and working in cooperation with God as we are here to do is the message of Jesus, the healing. And I think that, and I don't really know where I can find this in theology, is that we're all connected. I feel like all of creation is connected. And my thoughts, my actions, my feelings, they affect the whole creation and each other. And do you see where I'm going with this? feel like we're responsible. I know the demons influences as well, but I think our purpose on earth is to we contribute to the suffering.
Yeah.
It's us. It's us and the demons. It's not God. It's us.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I agree with that, and I agree with the interconnectedness. In the sense, that's one of the strengths of monotheism, is that if everything is connected to God, then everything is automatically thereby connected with everything else. And that's why you can, in principle, have everything in harmony, because if everything were in right relationship with the Creator, it would be in right relationship with everything else. That's how it works. And therefore, part of our task is both to get into right relationship with God, and then also to work at the relationships, of the horizontal relationships, to get those right. And then there's the joining in the divine assault on suffering in whatever way we can. And what does that mean? Well, the parable of the Good Samaritan would suggest is that which we come across, we are called thereby, our individual personal vocation is to try and deal with that comes to us, comes across our doorstep, comes across our path. That's our particular responsibility. Yeah.
I like that so much. Everyone's familiar with the what would Jesus do? And the critique is, well, what is Jesus doing? Tonight I'm thinking too about what is Jesus undoing?
Yeah.
Right? And how do we participate in that?
Yeah. No, that's really good. Yeah.
I was just wondering, when you thought about demons being the source of suffering, or where do you think suffering comes from?
Demons being the...
It's like the source of suffering.
Yeah.
Where do you think that influence?
Where do I think the suffering comes from?
Yeah.
Rather, as I was saying about the interconnectedness of everything, and that if everything were in right relationship with its source, the love from which it sprang, it would then be in right loving relationship with everything else. Once you distort that, once you get out of a loving relationship with the source of everything, you're going to be in jarring and competitive relationship with other things to differing degrees, but that's going to happen. And we were talking about Tolkien earlier. He has a nice mythological way of expressing this, where he talks about, he uses different terminology, but God conducting the angelic choir. And as they sing, the notes crystallize into matter and energy, and the universe is created through the music that God conducts and draws out of the angelic choir. And then one of the angels begins to sing in such a way as to draw attention to himself and make himself the center, and therefore it becomes discordant. And I mean, not in a pleasant discord, but in a jarring and oppressive discord. And that then distorts the creation of matter and energy in such a way as to make dysfunctional that which is being made. That's a pictorial, mythological way of putting it, but I find it quite a helpful one to help imagine how this happens, kind of thing. Now, it wasn't exactly like that, of course, but that's probably the best I can do.
Is your view fully consonant with view number 3? And what do you think about Fleming Rutt, which is she wrote a recent book, in the last some years, Crucifixion, where she says we don't have an explanation for something. For evil.
Yeah.
We do not have an explanation. We have a response. Most of us agree with me to oppose it and to heal it where we can. So I just want to know. First part of the question is: are you number 3 on the chart? Are you position 4? Or my wife's going to ask me this. I need to tell her.
Sorry, I missed that last.
My wife she's not here.
Okay.
She's going to ask me this question.
So you're going to have to right. I'll give you the script. Yes, I am group 3, answer 3. Yeah, yeah. I think suffering is inimical to the purposes of God. I don't think He ever wants it for anyone. And the ways in which the church has sometimes glorified suffering, I find psychologically repellent, I think. Fleming Rutledge's suggestion there's no explanation. Well, it's not a complete explanation, and all I'm offering you is a hypothesis. I can't, what I've said is not fully there in Scripture. I think it's consonant with everything that's said in Scripture. I think it helps explain how you can hold some of the things in Scripture together, but it's not. The story of the fall of Lucifer, for instance, is not in Scripture. It comes from a book called 2 Enoch, which we only have it in Slavonic translation. So, I'm not suggesting this is biblical truth. I'm offering it as a way of holding together all the things that Scripture does say. So to that extent, I think she's right. We don't have an explanation there given to us. This is speculation. But I think it enables us to, I think it does what needs to be done. It defends the goodness of God. It's pastorally, I think, okay, in the sense that it doesn't make suffering the act of God, which I think makes people's pastoral experience worse. All we can do is not make it worse in most situations. And it gives hope, because if it's not the will of God, it won't prevail. Suffering will not prevail. If nothing good depends upon the suffering, God can root out the suffering. So I offer you this piece of biblically informed speculation. That's what it is.
What you're offering me is a more mature and deeper attitude. How do I view this? And I'm sorry, that's this next question has to do with Fleming Rutledge critiquing classical views. There's the will of God, the will of man, and the will of man is opposed to the will of God. So there are 3 wills. There's the will of God, the will of humans, and there is the will of evil, which is an intelligent force. And you use that word in describing one of Jesus, I think their first scene there. There does seem to be, it's just not the absence. You could say it's an issue with Augustine, it's just the absence of good. Evil is just the absence of good. He said it's much worse than that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, is that acceptable in your view, or do you have any problem with that?
Well, the idea of suffering as the absence of the absence of good, evil as the absence of good, comes from Augustine, and it's not stupid. No. And it's right as far as it goes, I think. So the analogy that Augustine uses is, supposing you have a headache, and then the headache goes. You don't say to yourself, I wonder where that headache went. It's not a thing. It's a set of happenings within your neurosystem. And that's an important point. So when people say, why did God create evil? Augustine says he didn't. It's not a thing. You can't create it. It's not a noun. It's a verb. It's things people do, not a substance. Now that's correct. It doesn't actually solve the problem. And I don't think Augustine thought it did solve the problem. I think he thought it helped us to understand the problem aright. Because you can then reframe the problem of evil, not why did God create evil, but why do bad events happen? And you've still got a problem. And what I've tried to give you is an answer to that problem. Yeah, that's me whispering on. Yeah, sorry.
How might you pastorally counsel folks who take solace in that instrumental view, in the idea that God has in fact caused this, and so it is good for me in some way? How do you navigate that?
I mean, I wouldn't necessarily challenge it initially, at any rate. You've got to be pastorally discerning as to whether that's a helpful thing to do or not. But I would say, if it came to it, I would say all that you want to affirm is allowable on what I'm suggesting. It's just that is God bringing good out of suffering, not him intending the suffering. You've still got the fact that God can turn it to our and his and everybody else's advantage. I'm not denying that. I'm just denying that he intended it that way from the start. And my experience is that more people are deeply troubled by the idea that God is behind suffering than are comforted by it. Yeah. Because it makes God the enemy. And I know this is kind of rhetorically unfair, but what good did come out of my brother's stroke? None. Absolutely none. It put his wife and children under huge strain, huge stress, and it ruined his life. Now, what I can see shouldn't be the limit of the possible, and maybe there's an answer to that I can't give. But I think we're on safer ground saying God hates it. Yeah.
I just know that sometimes I've heard people use if Jesus said, "Take up your cross and follow me," it's like a justification for the instrumental view or something. That that's a suffering we have to bear with in order to, I don't know, get closer to God or something. So how do you respond to that?
I didn't catch all of that, but it was about Jesus.
Yeah, when Jesus said, "Take up your cross and follow me," I've heard that as a sort of, not exactly a justification for the instrumental view, but kind of a corollary to it.
I think Jesus is very realistic as to what was going to come his way and what was going to come in the way of his followers. Particularly in their immediate context, where he was claiming people's allegiance in a way that the emperor was also claiming. And if you make absolute claims, as Jesus was doing, you're going to fall foul of somebody else who's making absolute claims, such as the emperor. And that way lies crucifixion. So I think he's realistic about what will happen. He doesn't want it to happen, but he's saying it's a shortcut way of saying embrace the following of my way of being, and that will inevitably bring about conflict and difficulty that may lead to the same kind of outcome for you as it did for me. But just as he didn't want it for himself, he doesn't want it for us.
So I'm wondering about what the implications of the view are then for your salvation theory or your understanding sort of how the cross is functioning and sort of how it fits into God's design for creation. I mean, it seems like then the cross wouldn't be procuring salvation in a sort of mechanistic, objective way, but maybe that the cross is an inevitability that Jesus is willing to submit to, but it's not, suffering isn't somehow efficacious for our salvation.
It's a very good question. I think the cross is, in some extraordinary way, which I don't fully grasp or comprehend, or indeed even fractionally, essential. I do think it's essential. I think I would put it in terms of the bringing of the suffering of humanity into connection with God. I do believe in vicarious suffering, that there's a sense in which Jesus is doing this so that we don't need to, that he is taking on himself that which separates us from God so that it can come off us. I take a fairly traditional substitutionary view of the atonement. For one thing, there's a really interesting little book by a Catholic theologian called Hans Urs von Balthasar called Does Jesus Know Us? Do We Know Him? And he argues for substitutionary atonement on the grounds that if there isn't substitutionary atonement, there are areas of human existence of which Jesus knows nothing, namely guilt. And in which case, if he doesn't know anything about them, they're not dealt with. They don't have the resources of God brought to them. I think that's a very powerful argument. So I take a fairly ordinary evangelical view of substitutionary atonement. I just think that the suffering of Jesus was not necessary in the sense that no creaturely sin was necessary. And we'd have been better off without it. Certainly he would.
Audrey, do you? Yeah.
I guess I like the idea of like kind of like the spiritual discord causing like a material like suffering, but I'm still kind of stuck in the problem that if like God created spiritual like things, then like even if they have free will, why would they have the tendency to rebel? And if it's not some sort of evil already present, it would have to be some sort of suffering already present to make them rebel.
It's a very, very good question. And I think all I can do at the moment is to note an interesting fact, which is that in Jewish tradition, the fall of the angels happens very early on in the creative process. In one tradition on the second day of creation, and in another tradition on the fourth day of creation. So all of them early. Why is that relevant? That's relevant because creatures must logically be vulnerable in the early stages of their existence, because they have not yet built up a moral history. They have not yet forged a character. Had they been able to do right, act rightly for the first 1,000 years, for instance, I'm making it up, they would probably have continued doing what was right forever, because they would have built up a character that meant that though I am free, I'm just not going to do these things. But in the early stages, they're vulnerable because you cannot be created with a moral character. You're created with a blank sheet, and you're vulnerable to, you haven't got any ballast. And this is why nearly every time I talk about the problem of evil, somebody will say, how do we know it's not going to go wrong again at the end? answer, because what is logically possible at the end of the process is very different from what is logically possible at the beginning of the process. We cannot be created with a moral character, but you can develop one. And Mother Teresa, for instance, despite my taking issue with her views on the problem of suffering, take her as a kind of paragon of human virtue. Aged 14, she was perfectly at liberty to go and mug an old person in the street. Aged 70, she's still free to go and do that. But it's just she's become the sort of person in the intervening years who's not going to. That's not who they are. Through a process of predominantly right moral choices, through a lifetime of prayer, through a lifetime of the sacraments, they've just become the sort of person who's not going to do that. And when you then add the kind of final putting right of death and remaking, there's no root left of a desire to do anything wrong. So I don't think there's any risk of the thing going wrong again at the end of that. But I don't know whether that helps at all, but that's best I can do. Yes, and then?
Athanasius has a different explanation, which is that he says on the incarnation, how do we know this tape won't keep replaying? Obviously not his metaphor. He says because there's a very large difference between the first Adam and the second Adam.
So who says this?
Athanasius.
Oh, Athanasius.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
So in the second Adam, there's been the recapitulation. Humanity is completely redefined. So it would be impossible.
Yep. Well, I mean, who am I to quarrel with the great Athanasius?
So I guess my question would be sort of a follow-up to the previous one. Like, in this idea of, at the end, it will all go right because the people will be people who simply, even if they have the freedom to choose bad things, wouldn't. What would then become of all of the people who would? The people who, through their lives and through their actions, have become people who would pickpocket a man on the street or worse.
Yeah. There is logically the possibility that somebody will resist the lure of God and the wooing of God. And this may be another controversial moment, but my personal view is that to choose not to have God, I think God will respect that, but not to have God who's the source of life is to choose not to have life. That's what it is. And all the language of the New Testament about hell is about, actually, it's fire. It's about destruction. It's about burning up. God is going to burn up everything that is destructive. And if we won't let go of that, if that's become part of us, then we get burnt up with that. Now, whether anybody will be in that category, I don't know. I think we should work and pray for that for that to be an empty category. But if you believe in freedom, it has to be a possibility. Does that make any? Was that what you were asking?
It answers at least that question for people who have been made aware of God and of Christianity. But there are also countless people who lived lives without any concept of God's view of what they're supposed to do.
And I think people will be judged on the basis of what they've done with such truth as they've been given, not on such truth as they've not been given. And I can even where somebody has rejected what they have been presented with of Christ, where that has, sometimes the church has so distorted the person of Christ that people would be right to reject it. And I can well imagine a Muslim person whose mental image of Jesus is crusaders, saying, well, I don't believe any of that, and being right to, and finding when they meet the real thing, well, that's a bit different. That actually I've unknowingly been loving. So I think there will be surprises. I think people will not be judged on the basis of what they haven't been told.
Well, and I think that word of mercy and grace is a wonderful place to end. So thank you. We've really enjoyed this. Any last words for us?
Well, no, the last word really is simply that I nearly have kept you till 4 o'clock.
We'll release you from your suffering. Being here in the hot seat.
Yeah.
Can I just say one thing?
Oh, yes.
I'm here with Friends of Wycliffe Hall, an American group that supports Wycliffe Hall, and it occurred to me I ought to have a clipboard with a place. If you enjoyed this, we have a mailing list, and I would love to get you on the mailing list. We won't bombard you, but about 4 or 6 times a year, we'll send you a newsletter about what's going on at Wycliffe and other trips when Michael will come back over to Texas. And so I'd love to just get your name. And we also are putting on a summer school in August, and my colleague in Oxford, who's here with me in the front row, Matthew Armstrong, has some brochures about the summer school in Oxford. So we can talk to you afterwards.
And you get some, you get some good speakers like Tom Wright, and not just me.
Thank you for being here.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you. Refreshments on the lawn, everyone.